Hello everybody, I'm George Pully and today we're going to be talking about Liverpool and why they don't actually need to sign Jude Bellingham, despite everybody saying that they do. So, in the summer, Liverpool have signed 3 players. Fabio Carvalho, a young winger slash number 10 slash potentially deeper midfielder from Fulham on a free transfer. They have signed Calvin Ramsey for a low sort of figure, I'd say probably around 6 or 7 million. A young right back from Aberdeen who is obviously going to be cover for Trent Alexander-Arnold, and most importantly they've signed Darwin Núñez, the Uruguayan striker, for £65 million, an initial £65 million from Benfica. Now, despite signing 3 players, practically everyone is saying that they need to sign one more, that being a midfielder, because supposedly Liverpool need to upgrade their midfield because it's either too old or too technically inept, supposedly, and I really don't see this at all, or at least not in terms of the suggestions that many people are saying. Now, it is true that in many ways Liverpool have an ageing midfield. In terms of their first choice midfield 3, you have Fabinho as the single pivot, who is 29 I believe, Jordan Henderson to the right of him, who is 31, and Thiago to the left of Fabinho, who is 30. Now, obviously, that is an ageing midfield in quotation marks, but in many ways, what really is ageing in terms of the modern day, we're still seeing Zlatan Ibrahimovic playing at past 40, Cristiano Ronaldo still being described as one of the best players in the world at 37, yet supposedly Liverpool have an ageing midfield that desperately needs upgrading. Now, I'd imagine, to give these people the benefit of the doubt, that it's not necessarily about the players right now, it's that Liverpool supposedly don't really have any backup in terms of young players who can come and succeed these 3 players when they go into their middling to late 30s, supposing Liverpool keep them up until that point. And that's both true and not true at the same time. Now, Liverpool do have lots of young midfielders, which I think often gets forgotten about. People like Curtis Jones and Harvey Elliott are obviously very young, promising midfielders, and they also obviously have lots of other deputies as well, such as Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain, Naby Keita, James Milner as well, who is the opposite of young and promising. But it is true that they have many midfielders, as well as perhaps Fabio Carvalho now, who, while primarily being either a winger or a number 10, I imagine could play perhaps on the left side of a midfield 3 in Thiago's position, in a similar way to how Felipe Coutinho played in the 17-18 season for Liverpool. So they actually have lots of young midfielders. However, none of them really fit the bill, at least for me, as replacements for Henderson and Fabinho. Many of them fit the Thiago sort of replacement, I suppose, but none of them really hit for Henderson and Fabinho. But I think a lot of this wanting Liverpool to sign another midfielder is sort of due to some of Liverpool's midfielders, i.e. Jordan Henderson, being very unfashionable in terms of he's, from Sunderland, he's 31, he's sort of an industrious defensive midfielder who's being played slightly further up. He's been around for ages as well, and in terms of people just sort of being obsessed with transfers in the modern age, many people sort of really think that Liverpool need to upgrade on him, despite the fact that clearly Jurgen Klopp really rates Jordan Henderson. He's the captain of Liverpool and has been one of Liverpool's most important players under Jurgen Klopp, and is obviously instrumental to the success that Jurgen Klopp has brought to Liverpool in the past 5 or 6 years. So obviously Jordan Henderson is a very instrumental player, and a player that Jurgen Klopp puts a lot of faith in. Now, it is true that Jurgen Klopp has been resting Jordan Henderson a little bit, but he is still very much first choice in terms of, where when Jurgen Klopp goes to select his first choice midfield and everyone's fit, Jordan Henderson very much starts. And I think that's mainly down to the structure of Liverpool's midfield in terms of how Jurgen Klopp likes to structure his midfield is he likes 2 defensive midfielders and 1 more progressive midfielder, and that is because Jurgen Klopp likes the fullbacks to be constantly bombing up the top of the pitch and being the main creators. So whereas in a Pep Guardiola system he sort of has what you call the twin eights in terms of his midfield three, if we have Rodri or Calvin Phillips in the sort of lone holder, and then you'll have De Bruyne or Bernardo Silva to the left and the right of him, or Ilkay Gundogan as well is another option. But primarily last season he had Kevin De Bruyne or Bernardo Silva in those sort of 8 positions, and they very much burst up, make on-running runs up to the pitch, as well as being the main creators. Those are the main source of creativity deeper in the pitch for Pep Guardiola. It's not so much in terms of his fullbacks going up and making crosses or sort of passes alongside the goal, because if you look at sort of João Cancelo, he's very much more inverted in terms of he'll drift into the midfield positions to allow someone like Kevin De Bruyne to make his way up the pitch, whereas with Liverpool someone like Jordan Henderson will go across into Trent Alexander-Arnold's position, so Arnold can go up the pitch and make assists. So it's sort of the inverse of each other, so to speak. That's why Jurgen Klopp wants more so a sort of functional midfield to allow the fullbacks to essentially play as creative wingers most of the time to make assists, and therefore when they're up there at the top of the pitch you need someone to fill in the spaces and make sure that you're not sort of left empty and vulnerable to counter-attack. So Jordan Henderson and Thiago will very much fill the spaces and cover for Trent Alexander-Arnold and Andrew Robertson. Jordan Henderson more so, I'd say, it's very evident his sort of role on the right of that midfield three to cover for Trent, and then you very much have a very nice partnership between Trent, Mohamed Salah and Jordan Henderson on that right side, who everyone sort of knows their role. But that's very much why Jordan Henderson still gets into the team, is because he likes to have those 2 defensive midfielders in Fabinho and Jordan Henderson to make sure you're not vulnerable to counter-attacks, and to make sure you're not left defensively scarce, to allow the fullbacks to make their way up to the pitch and make crosses and generally be the main creators. Now, it used to be different. He used to have 3 functional midfielders in terms of Jordan Henderson, Fabinho and Gini Wijnaldum. So he very much used to have 3 functional midfielders to allow the fullbacks to go up, and that's how Liverpool created a lot of their success. However, in terms of trying to not just be very stale and to just shake it up a bit, in the 2021 season he brought Thiago, who, you know, can be defensive, but that's not really his main role. He's more defensive than someone like Kevin De Bruyne, for example, but still he's more so an attacking, creative sort of central midfielder, as opposed to Gini Wijnaldum, Fabinho and Jordan Henderson. Now, putting Thiago in that left space, that means that the midfield is more creative now, but it still is maintaining those 2 defensive options in a midfield three that Jurgen Klopp likes to have in terms of Fabinho and Jordan Henderson. Just thought I'd mention that why Liverpool are able to play one more slightly advanced central midfielder and play 2 defensive midfielders, whereas before they used to play 3 defensive midfielders with Gini Wijnaldum covering Andy Robertson's run up at the top of the pitch and Jordan Henderson slipping into the space to cover Trent Alexander-Arnold's run. Why they're capable of playing sort of Thiago on the left, and obviously he's not a defensive player really. He can do it, but he's not really. He's certainly more of a technical player who's wanting to make passes to the forwards. Why Liverpool are capable of doing that is, if you watch Andy Robertson, yes, he will run up the top of the pitch, but he's very much someone who wants to make crosses, so therefore he's sort of still on the outside of the pitch. So yes, he can make crosses, but he's not really going to cut into the box, so therefore he can still sort of run, and if he's sort of there in that sort of position, just sort of on the edge of the box, on the outside of the pitch on the left hand side, he can then sort of still come back and sort of maintain recovery runs to stop the opposing player from just instantly having the space and making a counter-attack and Liverpool being left exposed. Thiago is still on that left-hand side. He is sort of slipping into that Robertson space ever so slightly, but not to the extent that Jordan Henderson does for Trent Alexander-Arnold, because Robertson isn't quite so advanced at the top of the pitch, so then he can still come back, and that means Thiago, while still remaining on the left-hand side and while still sort of covering for Robertson, because he doesn't have to do it as much because Robertson isn't quite as advanced, he's going to make crosses on the edge of the box, he's not going to drift into the box. That means Thiago can be slightly more advanced than Jordan Henderson and drift slightly a little bit more centrally. Whereas because Trent, he goes up to the top of the pitch bombing on runs like Andy Robertson, but unlike Andy Robertson, rather than making crosses, which he does do a lot of the time, he will sometimes drift slightly more centrally and go slightly more inverted, which means he definitely needs sort of the cover from Jordan Henderson to slip into his space, which is why Jordan Henderson is slightly less advanced. He's more advanced than Fabinho, obviously, but he's less advanced than Thiago Alcantara, because Trent just needs that cover more on his side, so he will slip into that space more on the right hand side than Thiago will with Robertson on the left hand side. And that's how Liverpool are capable of playing a slightly more attacking presence in Thiago on the left hand side, while still having the fullbacks bombing on and not being left exposed. Because while Trent and Andy Robertson are very similar in terms of their fullbacks bombing up and making crosses, Trent is more likely to make inverted runs and be a lot higher up the pitch than Andy Robertson will. Andy Robertson will remain sort of on the edge of the box, on the right on the side of the pitch. He won't really drift into the box, and that means he's more capable of making recovery runs than Trent is, which is why Jordan Henderson needs to be a more defensive presence on the right hand side, and Thiago can be a more creative presence on the left hand side. Now, in terms of Jude Bellingham, it makes sense why people want Liverpool to sign him. In terms of the face value, it seems like Liverpool need a midfielder because they've had the same sort of midfield free structure for many years. Now, obviously, they have sort of brought through other midfielders and they have other young midfielders to come in. But people seem to forget that in a world where everyone's sort of obsessed with transfers and transfer culture, people just want clubs to be making signings, whether they really need them or not. I think the biggest example of that is Chelsea. They just seem to be signing players whether they really need them or not, spending lots of money for no real reason. But if you look at Liverpool, yes, in terms of, they need a new midfielder, who's possibly the most hottest young midfielder with the most hype out there, it's going to be Jude Bellingham, because he's 18 years old and is exceptional for his age. He's obviously English as well, and people really want young English players to play at the top level and play in this country and come through. So that's why there's a lot of hype attached to Jude Bellingham. He's technically amazing for his age, and also he's English, so we're going to obviously hype him up quite a lot. And it makes sense why he'd be linked to Liverpool, because as I said, Liverpool have had very much the same sort of midfield for a number of years, and in many heads that means Liverpool need a midfielder because they haven't signed a midfielder for a while. So it makes sense why he'd be linked to Liverpool, and I think also lots of people just want Liverpool to sign one of the top promising talents because Liverpool haven't really done that. However, there's a good reason why Liverpool haven't done that. They don't have the money, and this is why Jude Bellingham, while I sort of understand the suggestion on the surface, it's a very silly suggestion, just because Jude Bellingham is going to cost over 100 million. Why? Maybe you could say, well, you know, yes, he's very good technically, he's a very good midfielder, but he's still young, he's got lots to grow, he's not an 100 million pound player, I agree, but because of that, because of his age, because of his potential, and because Borussia Dortmund sort of got a bit done dirty with the Erling Haaland transfer. He had a 55 million release clause. Erling Haaland was worth a lot more than that, so they sort of missed out on a lot of money in terms of his sale to Manchester City that they couldn't really help. They want to squeeze as much money out of Jude Bellingham as possible, and because of his age, because of his potential, it's going to be over 100 million. Now, Liverpool can't afford that, and they will not pay that for Jude Bellingham. Liverpool, under the ownership of FSG and John Henry, have been a lot smarter than that in the transfer window. I've very much tried to spend as little money as possible on sort of more underground signings who can sort of fit into a system and do what Jurgen Klopp wants to do, and very much be moulded by Jurgen Klopp, and sort of he and the coaching staff can excel them to brilliance, but you're not buying them as the finished article when you sign them. Players who can do a job for you and Jurgen Klopp can excel, but they're more so underground that many people aren't really looking at, and therefore are going to cost a lot less, rather than going out and spending lots of money on the obvious answer or the obvious solution. For example, Liverpool didn't go out and sign Erling Haaland, they went out and signed Darwin Núñez. Technically he costs more than someone like Erling Haaland, but he's not the obvious option. He'll be moulded more into Klopp's system, and also wages a lot less. So FSG have been very much smarter with their transfer business. They haven't gone out and splashed the cash on the obvious transfers because they don't have as much money as someone like Roman Abramovich did, or the consortium run by Todd Bowley has now, or the sheikhs at Manchester City, or the money that Manchester United can generate. So they haven't had those funds, and therefore they've had to be a lot smarter with that. So they're not going to spend over £100 million on a single player, let alone an 18-year-old who is very much sort of not necessarily unproven, but that's a lot of money to spend on a young player, so to speak. Liverpool would never pay over £100 million on any player, and they certainly wouldn't do it on an 18-year-old who it's very much up in the air whether Jude Bellingham will come good or not. I'm not saying that Jude Bellingham is going to underperform, but when you go to a top club with an £100 million price tag on your head at the age of 18, that's a lot of pressure, and I really think you could see Jude Bellingham struggling. He went from essentially a free transfer from Birmingham in the Championship to Dortmund to going as a £100 million player to a place like Liverpool. Yeah, I can see there being a lot of pressure on you to perform there at such a young age as well. I've got to think Jude Bellingham is literally 1 year older than me. That's pretty scary. And also to a club like Liverpool, where they very rarely spend a lot of money on players. Yeah, that's gonna be tough, and I don't think Jude Bellingham would necessarily step up to the mark, just because it would be so hard, but no one would really be able to fulfill the over 100 million price tag at the age of 18, when the 100 million was mainly paid for your potential, not your current ability. Jude Bellingham isn't even a regular for England yet, so I don't really think Liverpool would justify spending that amount of money on a player. It's the same why I don't really believe the reports that Liverpool were in for Tchouaméni, just because yes, as I'll go on to explain later on in the video, he would have been a better signing for Liverpool than Jude Bellingham. Still, 85 million, he went to Real Madrid. There's no way Liverpool are spending that amount of money on a holding midfielder despite his age, and that's why he went to Real Madrid. So Liverpool may have initially been interested in him, but when finding out the price, I imagine they would have instantly backed away. And as well, Tchouaméni, Bellingham, they're the obvious options. When do you see Liverpool really go out and buy the obvious player? They don't. But also, regardless of the money, I very much think that Liverpool wouldn't go out and sign Jude Bellingham because they don't really need him. And discussing what I was saying, Liverpool play 3 central midfielders, 2 defensive, 1 attacking. And people say that Jude Bellingham should replace Jordan Henderson. But the problem is Jude Bellingham isn't the same player as Jordan Henderson. And what I mean by that is Jude Bellingham is more of an attacking midfielder. He's technically, creative, making bursting runs, that sort of thing. He's very much more, in terms of profile, similar to someone like Thiago than Jordan Henderson. And as we have already established, Jurgen Klopp doesn't like to play 2 attacking midfielders with Fabinho as the only defensive player in a midfield 3. He likes to have a Jordan Henderson or a James Milner alongside Fabinho, leaving only 1 attacking space. Now, yes, Liverpool could sign Jude Bellingham, but they don't need to spend over 100 million on him at that point. They don't need to buy him at that point, because they've already got someone like Harvey Elliott, who is also young and incredibly promising, and is very much the future for Liverpool, and that's someone they paid essentially nothing for. So you've already got Harvey Elliott coming through, as well as Curtis Jones, and yes, you have Naby Keita and Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain, who were always injured and probably aren't going to get any better, who personally I would have sold one of them in this transfer window and maybe the other in the next summer transfer window, because they're always injured and they're not getting any better. But you've got 4 attacking midfield options there, as well as Carvalho as well, so 4, maybe 5. So at that point, 2 of them being incredibly promising, heirs to Thiago. Why would you spend over 100 million on another one? It really makes no sense. So while Jude Bellingham is a very good player, He would never come to Liverpool because Liverpool would never spend that amount of money on him, and I think it would be a bad move for him in his career, personally. It's one that is probably unavoidable for him, but it's going to put so much pressure on him. But he'd never come to Liverpool because Liverpool would never spend that amount of money on him, and he won't come to Liverpool because Liverpool don't need him. They already have young, promising heirs to the attacking role. And that's not to say that I believe that Liverpool don't need a midfielder, though. And to me, people are sort of looking at the wrong options for Liverpool. They're going on about Jude Bellingham. But as I said, Jude Bellingham isn't really what Liverpool need. Because as I said, they've got 4, possibly 5 backups for Thiago. But they've only got one backup for both Fabinho and Jordan Henderson. And that's James Milner. Now people say, why is James Milner playing so many games for Liverpool? And this is why. Because as I said, Jurgen Klopp likes to have 2 defensive midfielders in a 3. And when either Henderson or Fabinho aren't fit, the only person, more defensive, solid midfielder they can put in there is James Milner. And that is why James Milner is playing a lot more games for Liverpool than perhaps you'd expect at the age of 35 or 36. Now, in the 2021 season, when Liverpool signed Thiago, they still had Gini Wijnaldum, and that meant that they had both Wijnaldum and James Milner to come in for Fabinho and Henderson. So they had 2 defensive midfielders, one who could very much slip in without any sort of drop in quality in Wijnaldum, who obviously was a regular for Liverpool before that point, and then James Milner, who's very much more of a certified backup squad player, but who also can come into those positions when needed. But upon Wijnaldum leaving Liverpool, that has just sort of left James Milner as the only one who can cover for Henderson or Fabinho. And at this age, Milner, he's not getting any younger. He's already quite old. He's an important figure in the dressing room, and he's very much someone who Klopp wants to keep around, which is why they keep giving him 1-year deals. He's a solid player, Milner, but I'm not sure at this level where Liverpool want to be, he should be playing quite as many games as he is, because one long-term injury for either Fabinho or Jordan Henderson, and that's James Milner playing the majority of games. And I just don't really think he has the legs for it. You've seen when he starts or comes on in lots of games, and particularly against good teams, they'll very much try and exploit his lack of pace in terms of that will force Milner to go in late on someone because they've zipped past him, and then will cause him to pick up a yellow, which obviously they can exploit further throughout the game. So this is something that I think if Liverpool were to sign a midfielder, they need another defensive midfielder, not just as an heir to someone like Jordan Henderson or Fabinho, but just someone to sort of cover, so you don't have to play James Milner as much, because as I said, you've got 4 backups to 1 position and only 1 backup to 2. It is a bit odd that Liverpool haven't decided to sort this out, particularly as I said, as Jurgen Klopp really likes to play 2 defensive midfielders in the 3. That's why last season against Tottenham in the midfield, I believe it was Thiago, James Milner, and then Tyler Morton in the sort of single pivot. Now, Tyler Morton is a young defensive midfielder playing in the academy. He was very good in certain cup games last season, however really struggled in that Tottenham game because he just doesn't have the physicality yet, and he's gone out on loan to Blackburn. Hopefully he has a good loan spell there and really picks up the physicality. But you could see that Jurgen Klopp was very much willing to entrust a academy youth player in that single pivot, rather than bringing in someone like Curtis Jones or someone like that, because he really needs those 2 defensive midfielders. And when both Henderson and Fabinho weren't fit, he was being forced to not only play James Milner, but also a youth player in Fabinho's role, because he didn't have another backup, and that midfield arguably cost Liverpool in that game. Now, I do really think Liverpool need a backup midfielder. James Milner is okay for the odd game, but personally, in terms of a defensive midfielder to come in and just ease the pressure on someone like Henderson and Fabinho, because I don't think Milner's quality anymore. He's a good squad player, but not as your sole backup to those 2 positions. Then yeah, I do think they need another defensive midfielder. Someone of the profile of someone like Declan Rice, someone who sort of fits that Henderson role, is a defensive midfielder first and foremost, can slip into that single pivot if necessary, but also can play slightly more advanced, like Henderson does. He can cover for Fabinho, or he can also play on the right of a midfield 3 and go slightly more advanced. The obviously problem with Declan Rice is he cost over 100 million, so that's never going to happen for Liverpool. As I said, they just don't spend that kind of money. But perhaps more of an underground player, someone perhaps from a foreign league, but someone who sort of fits that sort of profile. He was young, promising, and fits the sort of profile of a Jordan Henderson. I'd say is a signing that Liverpool sort of need to do. Klopp has ruled it out in this window, but sort of sooner or later, I think they do sort of need to make that signing. Maybe next summer. People saying next summer they should go for Jude Bellingham. No, they shouldn't. They should go for someone more so in this mould, because that's what they need. They've got plenty of attacking options and young attacking options behind Thiago Alcantara, but practically nothing behind Fabinho and Jordan Henderson. And that won't be such a problem if Jurgen Klopp was willing to play 2 attacking midfielders in a midfield 3, but considering he's not, I think he's left himself a bit threadbare in terms of that area of the pitch. I'd maybe sell one of your injury-prone attacking midfielders, someone like Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain, who's really there for excess. He's always injured, and Jurgen Klopp doesn't really rate him. He's never going to start that many games. Because Liverpool have too many midfielders generally, sell someone like Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain and bring in a younger, more defensive midfielder to challenge and come in for Fabinho and Jordan Henderson, and just give you more depth in a very key and vital position for Liverpool going forward. So thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like and drop a sub if you want to see more football based content from me. What do you think? Do you think I'm talking nonsense and Jude Bellingham is still a perfect option for Liverpool, or do you sort of see where I'm coming from? Whatever you think, drop your thoughts in the comment section below. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. But yes, thank you guys for watching, and of course, a goodbye.